Let's now check out prototypal inheritance and the prototype chain on built-in objects such as arrays. But actually, let's start this lecture by inspecting some of the stuff that we just talked about in the last lecture. And we will keep using this person example that we have been building. So let's start by taking a look at Jonas.__proto. And we already know that this is the prototype of Jonas, which is exactly the prototype property of person. And so therefore it is this object which contains the calc_h method that we defined earlier, so up here, and also this property, so this species property. But now let's actually move up in the prototype chain and essentially take a look at the prototype of Jonas's prototype. And do you remember from the last video what that's gonna be? Well, let's see. And it is indeed the prototype property of object. So that's why you can see that constructor is the object here. And then right away we see this method that we actually already studied in the last video. So this has own property. And so this is the reason why we can do this. So why we can call has own property on Jonas, like we did here in one of the earlier videos. So again, we learned in the last lecture that this works because of the prototype chain. And in particular, because this method here is in this prototype of Jonas's prototype. And so, yeah, that's this object that we are inspecting right now. All right. Okay, but let's take this one step further and check out the prototype of the prototype of the prototype. And do you remember what this one is? That's right, it is null. And so that's because object.prototype is usually the top of the scope chain. So this one here, right? So this one is going to be object.prototype. And so that's the top of the prototype chain. Okay. Now we can also take a look at that strange constructor property that we also saw earlier. So remember, person.prototype itself has a constructor property, which, as we said, will point back to the person itself. So constructor like this. And so here we actually get the function itself. Now, if we want to inspect that function, here we need to use console.dir. And so here indeed, we see that the constructor property points back at person. So that's this. Now, to make things a bit more complicated even, let's now take a look at the prototype of a function. So any function, of course, is also an object, and so therefore it also has a prototype. But maybe this is a bit too confusing, so let's just leave it here. So I will first show you the prototype of arrays, and maybe then we can move a bit further to functions. So actually, let's do that now. So let's create an array, just like with any random numbers. So the values here don't matter at all. All I'm interested in is now to take a look at the proto property. So the prototype of the array. So let's see. And here it is. So this is the prototype of array. And you see that here we have all these methods that we already know. So we have fill, we have filter, find index, and all of these methods that we studied in one of the earlier sections. And so this is the reason why all the arrays get access to all of these methods. So each array does of course not contain all of these methods, but instead each array will inherit these methods from its prototype. All right. And we can also check out that this prototype has got to be exactly array, which is the constructor function, dot prototype. So one more time, the prototype property of the constructor is going to be the prototype of all the objects created by that constructor. And so let's see, and it is true indeed. And just like in objects, using this shorthand basically is the same as using new array. And so therefore, whenever we create an array like this, it is indeed created by the array constructor. And so that's why all of this works behind the scenes. But of course, this is not yet the end of the prototype chain, as we saw in the last video. So let's see. And so now we are back to having object.prototype. You see, so this again now has own property, and then all of these methods here that are available for objects. And one more time, that is simply because the prototype itself here is an object. And so any object has access to all of these methods. All right. Now we would be able to see the exact same thing also directly in the console. So if I check out the array here and open it, then here in the bottom, you will see that we have the prototype property right here. So if we click that, then here one more time, we get all these array methods that we already know. Okay. And if we check the documentation on MDN, for example, for filter, then you see that actually the name of the method is array.prototype.filter. And that is because this filter method does, of course, live in the prototype property of the array constructor. So, one more time, you can see that the prototypal inheritance is really a mechanism for reusing code. So all of these built-in methods here have to exist only once somewhere in the JavaScript engine, and then all the arrays in our code get access to the functions through the prototype chain and prototypal inheritance. Great. So let's actually take this one step further. So we know at this point that any array inherits all their methods from its prototype. And therefore, we can use that knowledge to extend the functionality of arrays even further. So all we would have to do is to say array.prototype, and then here we can add any new method to this prototype, and all the arrays will then inherit it. So let's say that we wanted to create a method which returns all the unique elements of an array. So let's add a method called unique. So we set the unique property to a function, and then to get the unique values of an array, all we have to do is to create a new set and pass the array in there. And the this keyword is going to be the array on which this method will be called. And so now we just need to put this into an array and spread it like this, as we have already done multiple times before. And so we can now use that. So array dot unique, and this should now return an array with only the unique values. Well, we don't have a lot of duplicates here. Let's add another 6 here and maybe another 9. And so let's see what happens. And indeed, that worked. Beautiful. So just to recap, we added a new method to the prototype property of the array constructor. And so therefore, now all arrays will inherit this method. And so we can then call that method on any array that we want. However, what we just did here, so extending the prototype of a built-in object, is generally not a good idea. I mean, if you're working just on a small project on your own, then I guess you could do this. But really, don't get in the habit of doing this for multiple reasons. The first reason is that the next version of JavaScript might add a method with the same name that we are adding, for example this one here, but it might work in a different way. And so your code will then use that new method, which, remember, works differently, and then that will probably break your code. And the second reason why you shouldn't do this is because when you work on a team of developers, then this is really going to be a bad idea. Because if multiple developers implement the same method with a different name, then that's just going to create so many bugs that it's just not worth doing this. So it's just a nice and fun experiment, but in practice, you should probably not do it. Now, for a little bit of fun, to finish this video, let's take a look at some more built-in objects here in the console. So for example, we can select this DOM element here. And so let's do that, this h1. So that's document.querySelector h1. And we already know that all the DOM elements are behind the scenes objects. And so let's take a look at this object. Well, that doesn't really work. So that just gives us the object. So let's try console.dir on this h1. And so now we get the actual object. So here we have all this different stuff and all these properties and methods that we already worked with. But what I'm interested in here is the prototype. And you see that the prototype is an HTML heading element. All right, and so that itself will contain a lot of different stuff one more time. So let's scroll all the way down. And so this is now an HTML element. And do you remember these names here from somewhere? Well, these are exactly the types of objects that we talked about in one of the first lectures in the DOM section. Remember that? So we had this big diagram with all these different types of elements. And so now here we can actually inspect them. And so behind the scenes, these different elements are really different like constructor functions. So if we go down here, we should now see element. And indeed, here it is. And so again, you can recall that diagram that we inspected there. And then you will remember that HTML element was a child element of element. And element itself was a child of node, right? And so therefore the prototype of element is gonna be node. So if we scroll all the way down here, then you see indeed node. And now this one is event target. And so you see this is a huge, huge prototype chain. And only now we are at the end. And so the end is then object. And that's it. So this prototype chain has easily 6 or 7 levels. And so you see that it can go really, really deep. So if you want to go and check this out by yourself, then that would probably be a really nice exercise. And finally, let's just also console.dir some random function. So the function doesn't matter. I just want to be able to look at the function. Okay. And so as I mentioned a bit earlier in this video, the function itself is also an object. And so therefore, it also has a prototype. And in this case, the prototype will then contain the methods that we have used previously on functions. So that's apply, bind, and call. Remember? And so once again, this is the reason why we can actually call methods on functions. It's because they are objects, and objects have prototypes. And in this case, this function prototype. So you can spend a lot more time if you're really interested in exploring all of this. But once you think you have a good understanding of all the previous lectures, then you can move on to the next video, which is going to be the first coding challenge of this section.